Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Navina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Andrew Maury, and if you're not familiar with him, Andrew is a mixing engineer based out of New York who has worked with a ton of amazing artists, especially in the pop world. He's worked with artists like Shawn Mendes, Post Malone, Tegan and Sarah, and a whole bunch more. And if you listen to Andrew's mixes, they are massive. Like, the low end in his tracks feels so beefy and so full, but without sounding really muddy. And so that's something we definitely dive into in this episode. But one of the things that you're going to hear with this episode is that Andrew is the kind of guy who really understands the physics of sound. And we talk a lot about this concept of feeling the music, feeling it through your speakers, and how the wavelength of a frequency can impact how music hits you, and why you might want to consider that as you're mixing your tracks. I know that sounds super techy and sciencey and whatever, and so some people might be checking out, but don't check out. It's actually a lot simpler to understand than it may seem on the surface. But the way Andrew incorporates this into his mixes, it clearly works. And I think he does a really good job of describing that. And it's something that you may not have thought about before when it comes to treating things like the low end or the top end. I just think that the way Andrew talks about it in this episode makes a lot of sense. And it's definitely given me a ton of different things to think about with how I approach my tracks too. So I think you're going to really enjoy this episode because there's so much good stuff that we focus on here. And you're going to get better mixes if you follow this stuff. I guarantee it. So yeah, with that said, here's my episode with Andrew Maury. Andrew Maury, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going, man?
Doing well. How are you?
Not too bad. For people who might not be familiar with you and who you are, what you do, can you give us that background on who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into everything you're working on these days?
Yeah, I think these days I'm mainly a mix engineer, mostly known as a mix engineer. Especially once the pandemic started, things were very much centered at home, and I just found that line of work was really ideal. But before I kind of settled in just mixing, I spent a lot of time producing, and I even toured mixing front of house for a couple of years in my early mid-20s. Before that, high school and college, I was just like a musician, guitar player, band person, super into like all things production, video editing, doing lights for shows, and bringing a PA to various band events and stuff. I've just always been really hands-on with all things music and presentation and media. And yeah, so these days, just a lot of mixing, but I still do some producing projects and just, selective about what I get involved with. I feel like I really need to resonate with the artist and the music,
Yeah, for sure. So when you were getting started, like obviously you've done a lot of different things in the industry. Like, did you have the goal of working in the studio eventually, or was it kind of just like, whatever jobs come my way, I'll take those on?
Totally. I think it's funny. I've always thought that like it's kind of funny that I didn't realize at a younger age that I wanted to do this. I've always been so enthralled by music and obsessed with it, and the whole like record making process has always been really interesting to me. But I just never like thought to do it or like figure out who are the people that do that job and like how do they learn. And I just kind of stumbled into it during college. And yeah, I think like there came a point where I noticed credits. I was like, who's the mix engineer? Like, what is that? Who's the producer? What is that job? And I quickly triangulated like all my favorite records seem to have a lot of the same names. And I very instantly realized like, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to figure out this craft. So yeah, I mean, when you're in college, you're in your early 20s, I think it's good to say yes to pretty much everything and just try a lot of stuff. But the touring happened. I was mixing front of house on tour with this band, Ra Ra Riot. Just being thrown in the deep end, like learning live sound, which was really scary and challenging, but really whipped me into shape in terms of like understanding signal flow and mixing balance and tonality and effects and all this stuff. So, I just feel like everything I've ever done in music is part of the journey and related to becoming a mixer and producer. So
yeah, that's awesome.
It's all connected. Yeah.
Yeah. So then how did you learn the audio production side of things? Was it all just kind of trial and error?
A lot of trial and error. I took a few recording classes in college. I was a TV film kind of major. So my courses weren't really that oriented towards music, but there was a recording studio on campus, actually two, each part of a different program, but I realized like midway through college that I really wanted to learn more about music recording and production, and took every class there was available that was even adjacent to that. So I got some formal training in college. I had a really amazing professor who taught me about like the physics of sound and how digital audio works and just all this like foundational stuff. Not so much like, oh, you use this mic for this kind of instrument. And there was some of that, but it was more foundational, which I found to be really useful later on in this path. But I'm mostly a result of like the new era we live in, where so much information is online. I was digging through forums and interviews with people I look up to, and I would say like about midway in my 20s, like Pensado's Place started, and that was the beginning of a whole new era of like even more detailed, incredible information from the top. So yeah, I'm mostly trial by fire. I love a challenge. I just like to follow like where my opportunities are. And so, yeah, just taught myself mostly, and have had a couple experiences along the way that were really formative. I did a mix with the masters in France very early when that program started with Michael Brower. And yeah, I had an experience as a studio assistant working with Chris Walla, the guitar player from Death Cab for Cutie, who was producing a Tegan and Sara album in 2009 at Sound City. And like, yeah, I was 23 and just like had my mind blown by this full-on, experience watching a legit record get made. And so there's been a couple experiences like that, but I mostly just kind of learn by doing.
Love that. Yeah, I was curious to ask you about the Tegan and Sara record and working with Chris as well. Like,
Yeah.
What was that experience like? Because that was kind of your first big break in the studio and getting to work on a record that had some critical acclaim, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah, so I was touring with this band, Ra Ra Riot, and they got an opening slot on a Death Cab tour in 2009. And it was pretty wild for me because Death Cab is one of my favorite bands. And I knew who Chris Walla was before any of this came up. And the fact that I had this weird opportunity to be on this tour and then meet Chris and hang out backstage and get to know him a little bit, talk shop and whatever. And it just it just coincided with the fact that he was about to go do this album, and he was going to be playing bass and co-producing. So he's got a lot of hats to wear, and he needed an extra hand in the studio to run the computer. So through some chat, he learned that I knew Logic really well, and he was planning to record the digital elements to Logic. So he invited me to come out for 2 weeks to Sound City in LA right after this Death Cab tour finished. And, it was like, we only have so much money here, but you want to do it? And I was like, of course, I would do it for free. So, yeah, it was amazing. I learned a lot. I tried to keep my mouth shut as much as possible. It's pretty hard when you're 23, but yeah, I just like absorbed so much watching this team of experienced musicians and producers and engineers just make an album at a world famous studio. It's kind of a blur, years later, but I have tons of pictures and memories, and I just absorbed a lot, I think.
Yeah.
Mainly.
What were some of those big lessons that you feel like you picked up?
I think like overarchingly, it was just like observing the flow of a studio session, watching, and also the way they were working on this record was somewhat like old school, where they were all playing together on the floor in the live room, drums, bass, everything. Amps were isolated in separate rooms, but everyone had a headphone system, and they would do like between 20 and 50 takes per song. And it was sort of like a song a day kind of an approach. Everything had been demoed and written in advance, but no one had rehearsed as a band. So it was like Tegan and Sara plus Jason, the drummer in Death Cab, Chris on bass, and Tegan and Sara's touring guitar player, Ted. It was a 5-piece band, and they were just working out the arrangements and the details and the dynamics as they went. And all that stuff is familiar to me, coming from being like a musician and running bands in my teen years and stuff. So, but it was cool to see it happen in the context of recording, because, not only are they juggling the performance and arrangements, but they were like touching up the engineering as they were getting started, and like just seeing how all that came together, and also just observing like interpersonal dynamics. Like, you know, everyone hits a point during the day where you kind of slip into a bad mood, or like you need a break, or like there's some dissonance trying to figure out this thing with these other people. And to watch that and see the ups and downs, the roller coaster ride of the recording process, was really, really interesting. And I think, you know, I was really interested in being a producer at the time. This was more before I kind of settled into mixing as my main craft, but just seeing how all these talented people collaborated was like the main meat of what I learned, I think.
I bet.
Not as much engineering stuff.
Yeah. No, but I think that interpersonal thing is actually really important to the whole process. And, you know, obviously for your career, you know, being able to have those skills to transfer over to your clients and that kind of stuff, like that's really important as well.
Definitely.
Yeah. So then, yeah, I mean, that sounds like an awesome experience, and to get to see like the making of a big record and, you know, work with people like that, it definitely would have been very formative. I'm guessing, right?
It was. It really solidified in my mind, like this is my world. I can do this, you know.
Yeah. Well, prior to working in the studio, you did say that you worked on a lot of live sound, and I'm curious to know, like, you know, what were some of those big takeaways that you took from working on the road that you were able to maybe incorporate into your studio experience?
I think one pitfall of kind of being a studio person and like coming up through the studio culture is a lot of people sort of get really precious about a lot of things, like specific microphones, specific compressors, like all this minutia about just details. And this is stuff it's, you know, it's romantic. It's like the story of how records are made can be really like interesting and magical. But live sound is like the total opposite. It's just like this dirty old console in a small venue. There's like the sound guy who works at the venue doesn't care. You got 30 minutes to do a sound check and clear the stage. And it's just like all this chaos, you know? And so it really doing front of house on tour really drilled in, like, it got my priorities straight, which is the band has to sound fucking great when the show starts. And most of it is just problem solving. It's, you know, working out the system tuning, working out feedback, hunting down noise, like just all these basic things, and getting the balance right. The balance is king in live sound because you're not working with a limiter. You don't have to squish the whole thing into a box like you do when you make an album. And the PA has headroom typically. So you can kind of do whatever you want in terms of balance. And I just really learned, you know, how to get the core of it right, which completely translates to mixing records. So yeah, I clocked in days and days and days and days worth of time just with my hands on faders, which is an extremely invaluable experience, I think. And a lot of people who come into studio work these days, they don't ever get that. You know, it's just a mouse and a keyboard and a laptop and headphones. And it's like live sound is kind of the opposite of that. And so I'm really grateful that I got all that time to just play with it, you know, with high stakes too. You know, 1,000 people in the room. It's a lot of pressure to like learn fast and get good fast.
Totally. Yeah. I did some live sound for a while as well. And yeah, there's always that rush of like, you know, the band's setting up and you're like, oh fuck, I hope this works. You know, I got this crowd here. I can't be the guy to mess it all up.
It's completely terrifying. And you know, you're trapped. It's like, you can't like bail. You're there. You've traveled with them to this place and there's all these people there. And it's like, I have to do my absolute best. There's no choice.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that one of the other like big takeaways that at least I took in my experience working on the road, I'm sure you did too, is like the aspect of speed, because, you know, like you have to get up and running and be very quick and very, like, I guess kind of like what you touched on before, like you have to have everything set up properly to get that speed and to make it really work efficiently. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a pretty impatient person, so I think I'm kind of cut out to do stuff like this, but yeah, it really, I'm kind of glad, you know, I think it thickened my skin a bit, like in the formative years, like doing all those high pressure situations. Yeah, it was very valuable.
Yeah. Did you have any specific systems that like you implemented on the road to like make sure that things worked faster? Or
Um, Not really. I was definitely kind of a like go with the flow kind of tour mate. Like we weren't we weren't at a level where we had money and budget to like rent a console and bring everything, you know. So I was mostly showing up using house equipment. So first and foremost, like just like going back to the interpersonal thing, like you got to make quick friends with the house person, the house engineer, because you need help along the way, you know, throughout the night. So just like yeah, trying to just acclimate quickly to each venue and the people that worked there was important. And then I would listen to a couple songs through the PA before we turned on any mics, just to hear the system and feel what the subs are doing, and like you know maybe work on the EQ curve on the master bus a little bit. But other than that, it's just there's so much chaos. There's so many variables. Everything changes acoustically when the room's full of people. So sound check sounds different than the show. You know, there's just so many things that you got to deal with in the moment later. So I kind of would just try to prioritize like the most basic things, which is just clean signal, getting the balance right, making sure everyone's happy, monitors, mixes are good. Yeah, and then just you know, wait for the chaos.
of course. Well, you talked about like EQing the master bus, and I'm curious to know, like, is that something that's translated to your mixing side of things? Like when it comes to your process, are you like a top down kind of guy because of your experience in live sound, or has that kind of changed?
I think it probably informs it. I haven't really thought about that, but I think in general, like I've always had an innate sense of what something's supposed to sound like in any given context, whether it's the car stereo EQ or like my monitors or like a PA system in a boomy room. You know, I just kind of have like a internal idea of how bright the top end should be and how full the mid range should be and how much punch and deepness there should be in the lows. And like it's case by case. You know, sometimes you go to a certain room and you can just tell it's like this is a boxy sounding situation. Like I'm just not going to be able to pull off like a clear low end or like big giant sub. So it's just sort of rolling with it and trying to shape it so that things feel comfortable and like in a good starting place. But it always depends on where you're starting from. With a record, you know, I'll take a top-down approach where I shape the master bus before I touch individual tracks if I think that everything's generally sounding pretty good, if it doesn't need fundamental changing. If things are kind of blurry and a mess and, you know, I probably need to like work from the source, then I will. But I'm very adaptive, I think, generally. I think that's like an overarching kind of approach that I have with all things audio.
Yeah. So then when it comes to starting a mix, what's your typical mindset with that? Like, how do you start? What are you listening for? Do you have a specific process?
These days, I feel like mixing is more and more veering towards, it's just like a subtle enhancement on a lot of songs because producers are more empowered than they've ever been for mixing. You know, just like mastering engineers used to sort of have this like black art specific set of things they did. That technology creeped into mixers' tool set. And similarly, mixers' tool set has creeped into producers' tool sets. And so I get a lot of work where the producer's excellent and things basically sound done. I mean, there's plenty of mixes where I ask myself, like, what do they even want from me? Like, why did they pay me to... And I get it because everyone needs a little gut check at the end. But yeah, sometimes everything's in great shape and I do very little. It's almost like mastering. In other mixes, I just can tell immediately that, you know, yeah, this can be reinvented in a way that will really change it and enhance it. So again, you got to read the room. It's like, what are we starting with? So it changes drastically.
Yeah.
And it depends on genre. You know, pop music is built on a lot of samples typically, which are sort of pre-processed and EQ'd and compressed. But rock bands that tracked in the studio with microphones can sound really raw and undone. So it's just all different. And I like the challenge of working on different kinds of music and, having a skill set to know how to deal with raw microphones and also it's like super shiny, arguably over-processed kind of pop songs,
Yeah. It's a skill either way, right? Because just because something comes in pre-processed doesn't mean that it's going to work and that all the layers work together, right? And I think that that's like one of the dangerous traps that a lot of newer engineers fall into or newer producers fall into is that they just hear it kind of pre-processed and they're like, well, there's already processing on it. Like, I don't need to touch it. And it's like, well, no wonder your tracks like sound muddy at some point or like too bright or whatever, because things have to be, you have to prioritize the different elements of the mix. So I'm sure you run into that as well, where, you maybe having to kind of reverse engineer some of that pre-processed sound.
Yeah. And also something that should always be reiterated when talking about what mixing is the balance and how it influences the feeling of the music. And this was a thing that I learned from Michael Brauer in that seminar in France. And it's something he preaches generally, I'd say. But just changing the balance of a couple elements, especially when they're rhythmic, has major influence on the song and the groove and it's sort of bounce. Like, just changing balance can do that. And sometimes I feel like even if a rough mix sounds really good and it's EQ'd well and it has this like sheen and the effects are cool and it's all glued up, but sometimes I can envision a different groove. Like, just if the snare's a little bit louder, you're going to feel the backbeat more, or if the kick is a little louder, you're going to feel that downbeat more. And sort of that's the kind of stuff that I tend to play with when I feel like I can't add much sonically. I sort of think about the groove and the bounce, and if I can change compression a little bit or the balance, and just make the song animate a little better.
Mm-hmm.
It's all subjective, but sometimes I feel like that's the most you can do. Just give your opinion on something and hope they like it.
Yeah, no, but I think that that's a really good point to bring up too, because that balance, it can drastically change a lot of things. And I think a lot of people tend to focus on when they're mixing, because you can get into the individual elements that like people have this inclination to just like want to start EQing specific things. And it's like, if you listen to the mix, you get the levels up and then you're like, oh, there's not enough low end. A lot of people are going to go to their kick or their bass and boost a ton of low end, when really like volume may be the actual solution there to get more of that low end and get that feel. So I do think that that's a really important thing that a lot of people miss out on.
Yeah, I think I make an effort when I'm mixing to try to remember all the options, all my different tools, because every problem can be solved in a couple ways. And yeah, it's like anytime I go to make a fundamental decision, I sort of like run through the list in my head. Well, I could change the balance, I could EQ it, I could change the context, I could lower other things. Yeah, it's a giant puzzle.
Yeah. No, I think that's cool though. I'm glad you brought up that kind of mental checklist, because I do think that is a really important thing to think about. Because yeah, again, like people just have this tendency to want to use the plugins because like they're fun and you feel like you're doing something more in depth, when really like the simplest solution of like maybe bumping a volume fader is all you really need.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've noticed that as my career grows and I've gotten opportunities to work with bigger artists, better producers, just people who really know what they're doing, like the job changes a little bit. It really, really is more about reading the room, reading the rough mix, understanding what's good about it already and not ruining it. Don't just change it for the sake of changing it. There's some mixes I send back that are basically identical. And that was what it needed. And yeah, I try not to create like rabbit holes of communication and like differing opinions. You just gotta land the plane sometimes.
Well, I like that you touched on that as well, like, preserving that rough mix, because it's something that like I've had a lot of mastering engineers on the podcast and they'll talk about that, how, if something comes in great, like they may not do anything at all, right? Or maybe it's just like the slightest volume bump or something like that. Like, whereas you don't get a lot of mixers that talk about that. There's a lot of mixers that talk about maybe listening to the rough mix and getting some of the balance right, but like not enough people are focusing on like actually recreating it and maybe just preserving what's already there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you really have to put your ego aside to kind of embrace the what's great about the rough mix thing. And yeah, you just got to know when to add yourself and when to leave it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about when it comes to your mixes, like if there's one thing that I found consistent in the mixes I've listened to of yours is that your low end is massive. Like you do such an awesome job of like getting all of this like subby fullness in your tracks, but they don't sound muddy. And I think that is a really big challenge. You have a lot of clarity in that low end. And to me, it almost seems like you tend to favor having like the sub of the bass sit below the kick. Maybe, I don't know. Do you agree with that?
You know, it's funny. I think this is actually something, it's weird for me because I know that I have a large low end in my mixes. The method that I use to get there is it's a little bit like reckless feeling, or I don't actually give it that much thought. I mean, I'm definitely trying to make the low end great and big and stuff. I actually don't overthink it very much. The only thing that I need to know is that my intuition, my gut says that it's right and that it's cool. And I don't really go like insane with meters and checking specific things. I kind of just feel it out. And I know that's not a great or very interesting answer for this interview, but it's just kind of the way it is. I do a couple things on my mixes, typically if the track needs it, where I just inject a lot of low end with a few plugins. There's like this UAD Studer A800 plugin. In 30 IPS, if you hit it lightly, it just adds a crazy amount of cool low end to the track. That's something I do very often that helps put me in that position where there's like a large low end. And then similarly, I use the like Slate VCC plugin on the master bus, which does a similar thing. So I kind of set myself up with all this extra energy down there. And then I just shape things and adjust the balance to make it work in that context. That's kind of been a thing that I've been doing in the past 5-6 years, maybe more. But that's part of the reason the low end ends up really loud. Another thing is I don't use a sub when I mix. I just have ATCs as my largest, near field, basically.
And those things have a lot of low end in them to begin with as well.
Yeah, I suppose so. And they're positioned in the ASC attack wall tube trap setup, which really, for me, helps enhance the low end a little bit. So I feel like I can definitely hear clearly down to about 50 hertz. But I think there's also something about large sounding mixes where a little bit of chaos is good. There might be some wild stuff going on down there, but as long as it doesn't present, too starkly on playback, like it's fine. Chaos is good. And even just a funny example, like if I get a raw lead vocal mic and I'm building a vocal chain, I tend to not high pass it. Maybe if there's rumble, I got to clean it up with like RX or just, EQ a few plosives or something. But I tend to like the feeling of the human voice and all of its artifacts that live down near like 50, 40, 30 hertz. There's stuff down there that's kind of cool. Maybe I'll high pass a steep up to like 15 hertz or something. But I really think there's a difference with a compressed mixed vocal where you've chopped off below 80 hertz and one where you've left it open. And these are like the kinds of things that I'm always experimenting with and playing with. And I know a kick drum or a big synth bass is like a pretty different, obvious amount of energy down there. But I don't know. I think, there's a lot of magic in low end, and I think a lot of people hack it up too much. I think you can let it breathe as long as you fix the most fundamental problems. If there's a big resonance on something, maybe you need to dig in with EQ. But most of it can just be massaged into place and sound pretty cool.
Hmm. I think that's a really good point too. Like, I think there's a lot of people that when they're learning, they learn about high pass filters, and everyone kind of teaches this idea of like high pass everything except for your kick and bass. And as a result of that, they lose a lot of really good stuff there. And I've even seen people say like, even high pass some of your kick stuff or, the kick or bass, just like, maybe 30, 40 hertz or something like that. And then again, you're missing out on a lot of really good sub stuff that, maybe it really depends on your monitor situation, if you can hear that or not. But still, like for people who can, then you're getting rid of a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah, I think monitoring is a huge component of any conversation about mixing, but especially low end. I when I got this attack wall, which, if for anyone listening who doesn't know what it is, it's these tube traps. They're like these 4-foot tall cylinders made of industrial pipe fitting insulation. And so they kind of like are an absorber and a bass trap kind of, I don't know, I can't really explain the physics of it, but the attack wall setup is a monitoring environment that really cleans up the low end and the mid range. And it enables me to feel the speakers. Like, I know that sounds kind of funny, but I spend a lot of time thinking about the way my chest feels when I'm mixing, especially when when I've got the speakers cranked up a little bit. And I've been really trying to hone my perception on like the vibration, the feeling of the music. And I think with low end, I kind of really trust those sensations more than I do my meters or my whatever I'm doing. It doesn't really matter. It just has to feel right. And so that's kind of the main thing I pay attention to. And not everyone has larger speakers that can generate enough energy to like sort of tap into that sensation. But I do recommend trying to get yourself up to some bigger speakers and a controlled acoustic environment. Because once you're mixing where you're listening to your body, you're kind of tapping into like a new level, I think. And that's a journey I've been on for a couple of years now.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. It's for me, it's like, I don't even know how low my speakers go. It's all by feel. And like, I could tell like when something is like a little too brittle on my ears and it starts to bug me, like, it's just like, hey, got to back off on some of that top end. Or when like I can feel that something is like maybe way too, like it's just hitting me way too much in the low end. Like you feel that and okay, maybe I got to clean that up too. So I think there is that added layer of like, not just using your ears, but like, actually feeling it in your whole body and using that to help guide your mix decisions as well.
Yeah. And I think just one other component of this approach is like, you kind of need to like know when the monitoring is good. You need to like understand what a good response is. And I highly encourage people to get out and hear multiple speaker sets. And doing live sound was a part of this for me. Like getting to hear all these PA systems in different rooms really taught me how different every system is. And that goes for studio monitors too, and rooms and people's home studios or professional studios. But I would say collect a lot of intuition about what speakers can sound like and really try to make your own mixing environment like the best you can make it. Go visit a really nice studio and hear the A room and crank up the mains and feel what that is like and remember that feeling and see if you can get some of that going at home.
Yeah. Do you mix at a consistent level?
No. I know lots of people do, and I think there's good arguments for it, but I think there's good arguments for making the rounds, hearing all kinds of different stuff too. So sometimes I turn my ATCs up super loud, like irresponsibly loud. I'll probably reap the benefits of that in my 50s and 60s. But like I like to turn it up super loud, punish myself, finding out where the harsh frequencies are, feeling the low end, and then I'll spend a half hour on my NS10s off to the side at like the lowest volume I can make my monitor controller go. There's useful information to be taken from every context, and I think a big part of mixing is making sure that it's always working. So I'll spend a couple minutes on the NS10s really quiet, and I'll make a bunch of adjustments that seem right for that thing, and then I'll flip back to my ATCs and I'll be like, oh well, that's way too much, and then I'll split the difference.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like getting little clues from each system and different volume, and our ears react differently to different volumes, and we sort of process in our brain the sound of music differently at different volumes. So being aware of that is part of it, and just trying to find an average where everything's typically hitting the vision and sounding good on all speakers at all volumes.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that like you've now spent enough time in your room with those speakers that when you are mixing at those different volumes, you do have that reference of like how it should feel at that super loud volume too,
Right.
right? Because I think that might be like when people hear this idea of like feeling your speakers, I think people's natural instinct is like, let's crank up the speakers so I feel it. But you do have to learn how to listen to it at a low volume or loud volume or that middle level, whatever it is, right? So
Yeah.
you do need to develop that frame of feel based on specific volume references, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, the hardest part about mixing is maintaining dynamics where you get transients and punch, but also packaging things in a way where they're dense enough and tight enough that they can still project at a low volume. And yeah, I think the ideal mix, and at least in the genres I work in, is one where you could turn it up super loud in a car or nice studio monitors, and you can really feel those transients in the low end. But when you go quiet on small speakers, you can also perceive everything, and you feel a little bit of punch, but everything's tightly balanced and fits together. It's very easy to end up with a mix where it's nice and glued and it's tight, but there's actually not enough punch in the low end on a big system. It just, maybe it's too limited, it's too flatlined, there's too much compression. Maybe the compression's too quick on the drum bus or something. You know, that's like the hardest thing to pull off is a low end that blooms, but also is a loud master that sounds super tight on small speakers at like a low volume.
Yeah. So then speaking of small speakers, like how much emphasis do you put on or how much attention do you put into like making sure that low end translates to the small speakers? Like, are you doing any certain processing to ensure that happens, or what's that process look like?
Yeah, I definitely listen for it. It's kind of like, again, this is like the hardest part to get right, I think. At least I feel like I really need to bear down when I work on this part of the process. You know, can I hear the bass notes well on a small speaker at a low volume? Because it's very easy to over cue usually you kind of look at the low mids for that job, because small speakers just can't reproduce very much information under 100 hertz typically. So you have to make the most of the harmonics that live in the bass range in the low mids, you know, somewhere between like 100 and 300. So I will play with an EQ on my bass and my kick or my drums, boosting the low mids and trying to find a sweet spot where it feels like it really brings out those harmonics on the small speaker, but then when you flip back to big speakers, it doesn't sound muddy. And that's a tough thing. It's very delicate, and usually it's just a matter of balance and maybe not doing quite as much EQ as you think you need to. But there's a couple tools that I use, like Waves RBase or Max Bass are pretty clever tools. I don't know how they work, but they just do it. They inject extra harmonics in the bass frequencies, you know, typically good for adding like higher register harmonics. I really love the Waves Factory Spectre plugin, which is like, it kind of looks like an EQ interface, but it's actually an additive saturation plugin with like, you can sort of like shape it like you would an EQ with boosts, but it's adding saturation at those frequencies. That thing can be really cool for adding extra bass harmonics. But yeah, it's with low end, I feel like you have all these little slots, these little pockets of groups of frequencies that all have different tonalities, and it's kind of like you want to make like a cityscape of different bumps in that low end where, you know, 120 hertz has its thing with the snare drum, and then maybe 100 hertz is like where the bass is really punching through, and then 80 hertz has the upper range of the kick drum, and then down at 50 you've got another bump from the kick drum. Or, you know, I kind of think of it like that, and it's not a formula at all. It's just I'm aware that you can get each piece of the low end to kind of have its own little scene happening or something.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's definitely one of the things that I felt like I was noticing when I was listening to your mixes. And also one of the reasons why I thought like you maybe tend to favor that subbiness of the bass over the kick. Like I just felt like you could really hear the separation between all those different areas and different instruments, and how they all work together, but they each have their own space, so that like, yeah, you can hear that low end very clearly with the bass, or the kick definition is very clear and there's not a lot of bass in that area, you know, like it kind of just seemed like you were slotting things in a certain way. So Yeah.
This is like pretty heady, but one other thing that I think about is, and this kind of comes back to what I was saying before, like how much learning about the physics of sound was really formative for me. Like the lower the frequency, the slower it is perceived. A punch at 40 hertz, it's kind of inherently slow feeling. It takes a second to develop. It's a lot of work for the speaker, and it never really sounds very tight. So like, but as you go up the bass towards, I don't know, 70, 80, 90, things start to really tighten up. That information can be generated and hit you a lot quicker. And so I sort of think about that as it relates to the groove of the song too. It's like the more deep low end you have, the more slow the energy feels in the song. And the more you kind of prioritize higher frequencies, 100 and up maybe, the tighter it will feel. And so that's kind of a part of it too. It's like, it's not just the sound of the frequency, it's like the speed of the frequency, if that makes any sense.
That makes a ton of sense. And actually, that's the best explanation I've heard of it. Because as soon as you said that, I immediately was thinking, okay, yeah, you're right. Like, a lot of people will boost that low end, like that subby stuff on the kick, but usually it's because you want to feel it, but then it is slow and it makes things sound a little bit muddier. Whereas if you prioritize that low end of the bass, usually that's like a more elongated note. And so it kind of does make a lot of sense to think about it that way because, yeah, you're feeling it in a different way. And dude, that was like the best explanation I've heard of that. That's awesome.
I mean, when you think about it, a frequency is speed. It's how fast is the energy going back and forth in air pressure. So it's all related. Yeah, it's very easy to get distracted with just everything that's on the screen and all these interfaces and all these tools and all this stuff. I've just, I've been lucky to work in music for so long where all those tools have become very intuitive to me and they're sort of background now. I understand them so well. I don't really need to like think about it. So I'm on this path, this challenge to like understand deeper elements of sound. And I think, thinking about stuff like this is kind of what I'm into right now.
Well, I'm glad that I can drill you on some of these questions to get you that clarity or get you thinking about things.
You're getting me to acknowledge my own opinions here. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, even just that idea of adding the harmonics too, I think that's a really important thing that a lot of people need to consider because, a lot of people do think bass is just like 100 hertz and below, but there are a lot of other frequencies above that. And definitely the tools that you mentioned, like RBase, that's definitely something that I've used forever. And, I think it's such a handy tool, especially for getting that bass to get cut through on smaller speakers. It does do some magic there with the harmonics. So, something that people should be considering.
And there's really something to be said for that interface. It's just one knob, turn it up or down, and you don't know what it's doing. Like I've never read the manual. I've never had anyone explain it to me. It might just be a low shelf with like a compressor on it or something. I have no idea, but the fact that you just turn up one thing and you're like, do I like that more or do I like that more? Right there. That seems good. Like not having to pick all these variables, is it a low bell? Is it a shelf? What's the cue? What's the shape? Just too many things to think about. And then you're not intuitive anymore. I try to stay intuitive as much as possible.
Yeah, I remember running it through like some sort of frequency analyzer. And it is very fascinating to see what actually does happen. Because you can see like for anyone who's not familiar with this plugin, you basically get to select the fundamental frequency that you want to enhance the harmonics of. And, when you do that, you'll see like those harmonic frequencies start to boost up. And it is really cool to see how it introduces that stuff into the sound and to then hear it on the smaller speakers coming through. But when you go back to big speakers, you're like, it still sounds good. It's an amazing plugin.
It's very useful.
Yeah.
Waves nailed it with that one.
Totally. Well, you also talked about saturation, and that kind of led me to another question that I was curious to ask you. Like, another element of your mixes that I really like is how you treat your drums as well. And to me, it seems like you maybe lean a little bit on saturation, especially with like snare sounds. And that was one of the things that really drew me to your mixes. Like, maybe as a drummer, I just pay attention to a lot of snare sounds because I'm picky about that. And snares are always the hardest thing to mix. But
snares are the best.
Yeah, they're the best and the worst. But your drum sounds are awesome. And I definitely felt like I was hearing saturation on your snares. And I was curious to know, like, am I wrong in assuming that? Or is that something that you do tend to lean on?
No, you're right. like I know fundamentally that drums love distortion. Like they always have, they always will. You know, you think back to the earliest recordings, you know, into Motown and everything. There's just an immense amount of distortion on everything. All the Beatles records, super distorted. Drums love saturation because it sort of it just makes all the information like burst in a certain way, and you get all these extra harmonics, and it helps just thicken the sound. So I always go into mixing drums knowing that I want to use a little bit of heat everywhere. You know, like whether it's a drum bus compressor that has a lot of color, or if I'm doing like parallel distortion or throwing a decapitator on something. You know, I've just trained my ear to know when there is distortion or when there's not distortion on stuff. And it's pretty easy for me at this point to imagine what it would be like if I did distort something. So I quickly make judgment calls when I'm mixing drums, like we need more crunch, more saturation, more harmonics. And so I reach for a couple tools. But yeah, I think I tend to like definitely end up gluing my drums with some kind of a compressor that has like a saturation output stage or something, or you know, if the drums really need an injection of energy, I'll do like a parallel smash kind of track with like, you know, a heavy compression with fast attack and release, and then that feeds into a distortion, and then you play with that balanced against the clean mics. It's a custom puzzle every time, but yeah, I love distortion on drums.
That's awesome. Are there any specific tools that you generally tend to lean on for that kind of thing?
For a long time, I mean, it's been like over 10 years now. The Waves API 2500 has been a go-to because it has a kind of a cool like soft saturator output stage. And it really depends on the genre, whether it's like a rock song with a mic drum kit or pop production with a bunch of samples. Yeah, for some reason, like the Waves API 2500 has been a really just useful tool for me. I think it's flexible, and it kind of gives me a thing that I gravitate towards. Mm-hmm. Super old plugin. But yeah, I've tried a million things. Ultimately, I think it's just the balance and the tonality and phase, and like just getting the sources good is the most important part.
Totally. So then when it comes to saturating your drums, are you typically doing that on the bus level, or are you doing it on like individual tracks?
Very much depends. Yeah. It's different every time. You know, if I think back to a record like this band Louis Del Mar I produced in 2015, that was a record with a drum sound that was pretty heavy-handed in terms of like saturation and fat low end and stuff. Those were, you know, real drum kits mic'd up, and yeah, I was throwing decapitator and Kush Omega plugins on source mics, and yeah, lots of distortion at the foundation level, but then probably also on the drum bus. I can't totally remember. I try a million things as I'm working too, you know. I'll try it one way and I'll try it another way, and I'll see which one works better. I think in general, it's like a lot of mixing is knowing what techniques to try, but then ultimately it's like having the judgment and the taste to know which one is going to give you the coolest result.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of trial and error. And, you know, I just like, I don't really drink my own Kool-Aid while I'm working. I wait for this moment where I am moved by what I'm hearing. Like, I really don't believe that my ideas are like going to get me where I want. It's just sort of like observing the results as my subconscious is mixing. My more conscious brain is kind of like trying to be like, ooh, that's good. That's good. Just cherry picking the happy accidents along the way, kind of.
Yeah. That's interesting because yeah, another question I was going to ask you is like, when it comes to adding saturation, like how do you know how much to saturate a sound? Because, you know, people can definitely go too far with it and, you know, maybe put themselves in a corner with that. But it sounds like it's more of a feel thing.
What's funny about mixing is like 90% of the process, you're just in a self-conscious, like unsatisfied hell. You know, you're just like, I know I want this thing to be so great and I can hear it in my head, but I have so far to go, and you're just trying a million things. And yeah, I'm backtracking on my ideas all the time as I'm working. It's like making an ice sculpture, you know, it's just like, just chiseling away, take breaks, get perspective, come back. You'll know it when it's right. Yeah, and that's kind of the biggest skill to develop over the years.
I never thought about it that way too, but you're right. Like, yeah, like 99% of the time you're mixing, it is because the mix is imperfect. So you're just like,
yeah,
you're never satisfied until you're done. And then it's like, great, now I get to listen to the song sounding the way I thought for like a couple minutes, and then you export and you're done.
Yeah, you gotta be aware of that moment while you're working where you suddenly realize, like, wait, I think I got it. Like, I think I cracked it. And then you do a save as.
Yep. So going back to the drums and the saturation thing, then, you know, what's your reasoning typically behind using saturation? Is it to get more of like an elongated sound, or is it to soften frequencies?
Yeah, I think it's ultimately a way to sort of manage punch and transient and like you said, length. The more you distort something, the more the tail of the sound is the same level as the transient at the beginning. So drums have a tendency to be too spiky unless they're processed to a certain degree. If you just record like condenser mics on a drum set straight into an Apollo with no distortion or compression or anything, you're left with this pile of signal that is just like so sharp. And that might work for certain genres like jazz or something, especially if the player's playing lightly. But if it's loud, heavy music, like you have to decrease the dynamic range in a couple ways. And compression's one way to do it, but saturation is equally useful. And I think I just aim for a combination of compression and saturation. And every song calls for a different ratio.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just this innate feeling like I need to hear. I think you're onto something when you mention length. I think that's part of it. Like a distorted snare drum, it sounds longer.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's what the groove needs, you know?
Yeah, I think you were also onto something there when you mentioned like the idea of the jazz drummer who's playing lightly and why it works so well. And I think that musicians have this tendency of, especially drummers, it's like when you think of like a loud rock mix, you think of people hitting the drums really hard. And there is something to be said for that. You want to get all that energy and that attack and all that. But in doing so, you're also kind of choking off the drum a little bit the harder you hit it. So sure, you're getting that initial stick attack and you're getting lots of that, but you're just the way your stick's hitting the drum, it's literally choking off the skin. So you do get a little bit of a shorter sound. So I do think that when you're adding that saturation in there, it does give you a little bit more of that length and fill out kind of what you were trying to go for. But it's just like that. There's that balance in how hard you're playing a drum kit.
And this is kind of how musicianship and playing ability relates to engineering. Great players know how to hit the sweet spot on their instrument. This is true of guitars, bass, probably piano, drums, definitely. Like every instrument seems to have a spot, it's dynamic. It's like the harder you dig into a guitar, yes, the more attack you get, but the strings go a little sharp on every hit. And like there's just all these nuances that happen. The harder you play something, the more it kind of chokes out and like the tone doesn't bloom as much. So I think one thing that I've come to learn with recording is like, just knowing the difference between the tones that are generated by someone who's playing super loud and someone who's playing more modestly. And I've come to really realize that modest velocity playing has a ton of tone. And this is true of drums. You hit a snare drum kind of medium velocity right in the middle with a nice bounce, you get this like big fat bloom in the mid-range and low end. And if you whack it super hard and you kind of hit the rim, it's just like an instantaneous burst of white noise with like this like clanging sound, It's like two very different things just based on how you hit it. So being aware of all this stuff when producing or recording is, and helping coach people to understand that as they track can be useful. Some people just bash away. That's all they know, and you just gotta ride the wave, but more nuanced players are really good at developing the tone at the source.
Totally, yeah. There's something to be said for if you want to perform live and make it like a spectacle, then maybe you're going to hit a little harder. But in the studio, you also need to know how to dial it back to get that sound to come through the mics and out of the speakers.
Right.
So
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up too. Yeah, going back to again to like the snare sounds and with your saturation, like one of the really cool byproducts of the way I think you use saturation is that you're getting that attack, you're getting that sustain of the drum. But I also felt like the way that you use it in particular, and I don't know if this is just like your settings that you're using, but it also felt like the snares weren't getting in the way of the vocals. You actually had this really great way of getting the attack of the drum to come through, but without it poking in the same frequency range as the vocals. And I think for a lot of the pop music that you're working on, that's a really important thing.
Yeah. That might be something that just happens intuitively. I don't think about that very often, but I definitely strive to always want to hear a lead vocal that's like very vivid. And like if you want to look at the vocal between the speakers, like you can, like that's something I push for when I work. But I think that might be more a result of just the EQ and the compression details of the vocal than it is like the snare drum settings. Like, I don't know, if the snare drum feels good on its own, I tend to leave it and just make things work around it. But I don't know. Yeah. I like the idea of that being a result in my mixes. So
yeah,
I'm
no,
glad
it's definitely one of the things I noticed. Like, especially listening to like the Shawn Mendes stuff, it's like the snares are still big, but the vocal is on top of it. And
yeah,
there's like a clarity there that I think has a lot to do with the way that the saturation hits the drums.
Yeah, I think one thing I pay a lot of attention to with lead vocal is attack time on the compressor. And I tend to go for a pretty slow attack so that the beginning of every word or like the front of every, syllable has a dynamic to it. And that helps keep the vocal forward. You start to speed up the attack on the vocal, it starts to push the vocal backwards in the soundscape. And maybe some people have a little bit too quick of compression happening, and that's why the snare might end up feeling like it's in front of the vocal or something. But I like to give a lead vocal like tons of fidelity and space to push and pull like forward in the mix. Obviously, a vocal can be too loud, but I really work to get the sweet spot where the vocal's balanced in the right spot, but has enough swing dynamically with the compression settings so that it can still command like the center of the mix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that does come down to like really prioritizing it in the mix so that, maybe like you said, you want that, like the consonants and stuff like that of your vocals to jump out and have those natural dynamics. So that might mean that you do have to go a little softer with the other elements of the mix so that that vocal does sit on top of it a lot more and you can feel those dynamics a lot more than anything else going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome, man. It definitely seems like, one of the themes that's come up here is the idea of feeling your mix and like, feeling it out of your speakers, but also feeling the way you get the impact of your tracks. And I think that's a really cool way of looking at it. And it shows, man, when you listen to your tracks, they sound great. So you're doing something right there.
Thank you.
At the end of the day, like what in your opinion makes a great mix? How do you know when it's done?
I mean, this is a pretty commonly said answer now, but like you should be able to listen to it passively and not notice anything. I think that's one way to be able to sign off. You're never done. I mean, it's always like you could maybe improve a million things, but at a certain point you got to let it go. And I think that's one thing I do. And also I really trust the people I'm collaborating with. Like, I like working with artists who have an opinion and like know music and know how to speak the language of music and production and mixing. And yeah, I really try not to be like the expert by default. Like, a lot of artists I work with have very strong opinions about balance, where they want the vocal to sit or how much brightness they want on the track. And I have to respect their opinion on those kinds of things and then make it feel complete in that context. So I don't know. I think it's mainly intuition. I think just my entire life experience with music has shaped my idea of what I want to hear. And it's almost impossible to put into words, but I don't know. I've always been fascinated by sound and instruments and, even when I was a little kid, like I was like identifying instruments and songs and music, and my parents were like, what the hell? It's been kicking around in my brain forever. And I have strong opinions about what I like. And it's really hard to put into words, but I just keep keep tinkering with the mix until I feel like I got there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does make sense. Like, it is a very hard thing to quantify. And so,
and that's why we're all different. And that's why different mixers get different work. Some of it's like a pigeonholing effect where you work on one big record in one genre and then everyone wants to work with you for that thing. But like, just different mixers have different life experiences and ideas of what music should sound like. And, also just different like musical experiences. One engineer might be a bass player who has had a different mental framing of like their role in music than a flashy lead singer type producer. Like, these are different perspectives on music that inform choices. And there's a million ways to fit a mix together. Like, there's no right way. It just has to feel musical and moving ultimately in the end. There's a lot of chance involved, There's no guarantees that any mix is the right mix.
Yep, that makes sense. What instrument did you play?
Guitar.
Okay, cool. I was curious because you most of the time you kind of tell what instrument people play by their mixes. Like they tend to favor certain elements, but I'm surprised by that.
I'm like a secret drummer at heart, though. Like I never had a drum set growing up, regrettably, but I'm like obsessed with drums. Like drummers are the coolest people in the world. I'm totally convinced. And I have a drum kit here in my studio now, so I wail away, and I'm trying to get better over the years. But like, I'm very drawn to drums as an instrument. But I grew up playing guitar mainly, just like learning, Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and all kinds of stuff that was like challenging to me in my teen years. So, the lead guitar was my thing, but I've always been into all instruments and can play bass and drums and stuff too.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's interesting. I would have guessed, again, with that low end conversation, I would have thought maybe you're a bass player or something like that. But
I mean, I can play bass. My dad's a bass player. I learned a lot of what I know from my dad, just in terms of like how music works. But I don't know. I think I maybe have a well-rounded like perspective on instruments. But yeah.
Well, it also makes sense too because you're such a big feel guy that it does make sense that rhythm section would also be a big part of your mixes. So maybe that's the answer there. Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, if people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I think my website, andrewmaury.net, tends to be like the best place to kind of see everything that I've done or, kind of what my world looks like. But if you follow me on Instagram at AEMaury, I do some posts where I'd like, big up recent releases or like just maybe some random studio footage or something. But
awesome. Cool, man. Well, I'll definitely include those in the show notes. But Andrew, thank you for taking the time to do this. It definitely was really informative, at least like for me. I definitely learned a lot about your process and the way you analyze your tracks, and I'm sure the audience did as well. So thanks for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
So that was my episode with Andrew Maury, and I really thought that he did such a great job of explaining his mindset in terms of how he's feeling the sound and how you can implement that into your process too. And I thought it was really fascinating to get into the weeds of talking about how the way you play your instrument can really change the dynamics of your track. Obviously, like people think of like you hit something loud, it's loud, right? Like that makes sense. But the way that he was talking about how when you're hitting a string on a guitar, or the way we were talking about when you hit a drum a certain way, how you can get the note to have more sustain and length to it while still having the attack. And then when you combine that in with things like saturation in the mixing stage, you can really shape the sound to make it feel a lot more full, but still have a lot of that impact and dynamic range. And I just think that's a really interesting thing that a lot of people don't think about. A lot of people are just so used to performing their music as opposed to understanding how to play into it so that it comes out through the mics and through the speakers when you're mixing or when you're recording. So I thought it was really interesting to get into that kind of conversation with Andrew here today. And also, I really enjoyed learning more about his approach to how he handles the low end and talking about like how the speed of frequencies impacts the mixing process. And, it really kind of set off a light bulb in my head when he was talking about how low frequencies, like the really subby stuff, kind of takes more time to develop. And so it does make sense that if you tend to focus on the subbiness of your bass, where you're getting more of an elongated note, that would be favorable. And so when it comes to your relationships between your kick drum and your bass guitar, it is something that if you are factoring in the wavelengths and how sound travels, it can really make for a cool way of prioritizing your tracks and understanding where things should fit within the frequency spectrum. So I love that Andrew touched on that because it's kind of a unique way of thinking about your mixes. And it definitely works. Like I said, if you listen to his tracks, his bass sounds massive. So, if you don't believe me, listen to his songs, and I think you'll agree afterwards. So, yeah, I really enjoyed that conversation with Andrew, and it was really fascinating to learn, how to try to quantify how to actually feel your speakers, and what really goes into that. And I think a lot of it has to do with the performances that people are playing and how the dynamics are a factor there, but also understanding the physics of sound as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed that, and I hope you did too. If you did, make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And also, if you're interested in learning more about this stuff, if you're not sure what to be doing when it comes to things like your recording process and how to get great source tracks like Andrew was talking about here, or how to EQ your tracks to get them to translate across multiple sets of speakers, and especially like your low end and making sure that will work on a small speaker. If you're looking for help along the way with that process and you want someone to be able to give you feedback and actionable steps to achieve that, that is exactly what I help my students out with inside of my program, Amplitude. And inside of that program, I work one-on-one with my students and work on their tracks together so that we can get your song sounding the way that you've always heard it in your head, and that you can get that maximum impact. You can get your tracks to translate properly, and so that you're not confused throughout the process. That's something I know a lot of people struggle with. They're not sure if they're taking the right steps. So by having a coach in your corner who can show you the steps and validate what you're doing and make sure that you're on the right path, it's going to guarantee that you're going to be happier with the results and you're going to get the sounds that you've always wanted. So if you're interested in learning more about that program, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And then I'd love to hop on a call with you. I'd love to learn more about you and your goals and your process and what projects you're working on right now to see how I can truly help you. And I only accept people in this program who I truly believe I can help. So if it does seem like you'd be a good fit and that I can help you, then I'd love to work with you on your tracks and make your vision for your songs actually come to life. So once again, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com/amplitude to find out all the details there. Now, with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit MasterYourMix.com.